The midnight express to Dover had earned its reputation not through speed, but through exclusivity. It departed London's Victoria Station at precisely 11:45 each Friday evening, carrying a carefully curated collection of the wealthy, the titled, and the influential toward the Channel crossing and the continent beyond. The train's first-class carriages were appointed with mahogany paneling, velvet upholstery the color of burgundy wine, and brass fixtures polished to a mirror shine. It was a world unto itself, a floating island of privilege hurtling through the darkness of the English countryside. On this particular Friday in late October 1934, the autumn fog had settled over London like a grey blanket, muffling the usual cacophony of the station. The platform was slick with moisture, reflecting the amber glow of the gas lamps in wavering pools of light. Passengers hurried aboard with their luggage, their breath forming small clouds in the chill air, while porters in crisp uniforms attended to steamer trunks and hat boxes with practiced efficiency. Among those boarding the midnight express was a man who would not live to see the white cliffs of Dover. Sir Reginald Ashcroft, 62 years of age, presented an imposing figure even in his final hour of life. He was a man whose very presence commanded attention. Tall, with a leonine mane of silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and eyes of such piercing grey that they seemed to look through rather than at those unfortunate enough to be subjected to his gaze. His wealth, accumulated through a combination of colonial mining ventures and shrewd investments in armaments, was matched only by his reputation for ruthlessness in business and callousness in personal matters. Sir Reginald travelled alone in compartment 3A, a private sleeping compartment that occupied a privileged position in the first carriage. He had dismissed his valet earlier that evening, preferring solitude for the journey. The compartment was small but luxuriously appointed. A padded bench that converted to a bed, a fold-down washstand with a mirror, a small writing desk beneath the window, and a door that could be locked from the inside. The single window looked out onto the platform, though now, as the train prepared for departure, the fog rendered the view nearly opaque. At 11:43, precisely 2 minutes before the scheduled departure, the conductor made his final rounds, checking tickets and ensuring all passengers were properly settled. He rapped twice on the door of compartment 3A. "All secure, Sir Reginald?" he called through the heavy wood. "Quite secure, thank you," came the reply, the voice carrying that particular tone of aristocratic dismissal that discouraged further conversation. The conductor moved on. He would later recall with the painful precision of hindsight that Sir Reginald's voice had sounded entirely normal, neither distressed nor alarmed, simply impatient to be left alone. At 11:45 exactly, the midnight express released its brakes with a hiss of compressed air and began its stately departure from Victoria Station. The platform slid away into the fog, and in London's lights gradually gave way to the impenetrable darkness of the suburbs and then the countryside beyond. The other occupants of the first-class carriage settled into their various accommodations. There were 5 other private compartments in the carriage and a small sitting room at the far end where passengers might socialize over brandy or coffee. By midnight, most had retired to their compartments. The train rushed onward through the night, its rhythmic clatter a soporific soundtrack to the journey. It was at approximately 1:15 in the morning that the crime was discovered. Miss Evelyn Carruthers, a spinster of 45 who occupied compartment 3C directly adjacent to Sir Reginald's, had been unable to sleep. She later testified that she had heard nothing unusual throughout the journey, no sounds of struggle or distress, which she found remarkable given the thinness of the walls between compartments. What she had heard, or rather failed to hear, was any sound at all from compartment 3A after the train's departure. This absence of sound, no rustling of papers, no creaking of the bed, no footsteps, not even the sound of Sir Reginald's notorious snoring, had gradually impressed itself upon her consciousness as unnatural. Sir Reginald Ashcroft was not a man who moved quietly through the world. At 1:12, Miss Carruthers emerged from her compartment, clutching her dressing gown about her thin frame, and made her way toward the conductor's station at the front of the carriage. She found the conductor, a man named Walter Grimsby, who had served on this route for 17 years, dozing in his fold-down seat. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you," she said, her voice tight with anxiety, "but I'm concerned about Sir Reginald in compartment 3A. I've heard nothing from his compartment since we departed, and it's not like him to be so quiet." Grimsby, shaking off sleep, accompanied Miss Carruthers back to compartment 3A. He knocked firmly on the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the narrow corridor. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, and called out, "Sir Reginald! Sir Reginald Ashcroft!" Silence. A sensation of unease began to creep over both Grimsby and Miss Carruthers. The conductor tried the handle and found it locked from the inside. He had a master key, of course, for emergencies, but he hesitated to use it. Bursting into a first-class passenger's locked compartment without cause could end his career. "Perhaps he's taken a sleeping draught," Miss Carruthers suggested, though her tone conveyed her doubt. "Perhaps," Grimsby agreed, but he was already reaching for his key ring. The master key turned smoothly in the lock. Grimsby opened the door. The scene that greeted them would be forever seared into their memories. Sir Reginald Ashcroft sat in the corner of the compartment, wedged between the wall and the seat, his body slumped at an unnatural angle. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling, and his mouth hung slack. His face had taken on a peculiar grayish-blue cast, and a thin line of dried saliva traced from the corner of his mouth down his chin. But it was his hands that arrested the attention most forcefully. They were clutched around his own throat, the fingers frozen in a rigid grip, as though in his final moments he had been desperately trying to tear something away from his neck. There was no visible wound, no blood, no sign of violence beyond the horrifying posture of the body itself. Miss Carruthers let out a small strangled sound and turned away, pressing her handkerchief to her mouth. Grimsby, his face pale, reached forward to check for a pulse, though the corpse-like stillness of Sir Reginald made the gesture purely formal. The skin beneath his fingers was cool, not yet cold, but no longer warm. No pulse stirred. "Lord have mercy," Grimsby whispered. "He's dead." The conductor's training reasserted itself. He gently guided Miss Carruthers away from the compartment, closed and locked the door, and moved swiftly to wake the train manager. Within 15 minutes, the midnight express had made an unscheduled stop at Bromley South Station. The station master was roused from his lodgings, a telegram was dispatched to Scotland Yard, and the local police were summoned. The passengers in the first-class carriage, those who had not already been awakened by the commotion, were roused and informed that they would not be permitted to leave the train or their carriage until the police had completed their investigation. By 2:30 in the morning, Detective Inspector Hardcastle of the Kent Constabulary had arrived on the scene. He was a solid, methodical man with 20 years of experience, a thick mustache, and an unshakable faith in his own judgment. After examining the body in situ, photographing the scene, and taking preliminary statements from Grimsby and Miss Carruthers, Van Hardcastle assembled the passengers in the sitting room at the end of the carriage. There were 6 of them, including Miss Carruthers, Miss Evelyn Carruthers, the woman who had discovered the body, a governess returning from a family visit in London, Dr. Marcus Bellamy, a physician of approximately 50 years, traveling to a medical conference in Brussels, occupying compartment 3B, Lady Constance Ashcroft, Sir Reginald's estranged wife, from whom he had been separated for 3 years, occupying compartment 3D. Mr. Julian Merrick, a handsome man of 35, an art dealer, occupying compartment 3E. Mrs. Daphne Pemberton, a wealthy widow of 40, traveling with her companion, occupying compartment 3F. Miss Lily Hartwell, Mrs. Pemberton's companion, a young woman of 23, sharing compartment 3F. That Inspector Hardcastle surveyed this assembly with a practiced eye. They sat in various states of dress and distress, Lady Constance wrapped in an elegant silk dressing gown, her face composed but pale, Dr. Bellamy fully dressed, his medical bag at his feet, Mr. Merrick dishevelled and bleary-eyed, the two women from compartment 3F huddled together on a settee. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hardcastle began, his voice carrying the flat authority of rural police work, "I regret to inform you that Sir Reginald Ashcroft is dead. The circumstances are suspicious, and I must ask each of you to account for your movements from the time of the train's departure until the body was discovered." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Lady Constance's hand moved to her throat, then dropped back to her lap. Dr. Bellamy's expression remained professionally neutral. Miss Carruthers dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. "Suspicious?" Lady Constance spoke first, her voice carefully controlled. "How did he die, Inspector?" "That," said Hardcastle grimly, "is what we intend to determine. Dr. Bellamy, as you are a physician, I would appreciate your professional opinion after viewing the body." The examination that followed was brief. Dr. Bellamy returned to the sitting room within 10 minutes, his face troubled. "The symptoms are consistent with poisoning," he reported quietly. "Some form of rapid-acting toxin, I should say. The cyanotic discoloration, the muscle rigidity, the apparent asphyxiation, these all point to interference with respiration at the cellular level. Without a proper autopsy, I cannot be more specific, but if I had to hazard a guess, I would say cyanide or possibly strychnine." "Could it have been self-administered?" Hardcastle asked sharply. "It's possible, but unlikely. The posture of the body suggests he was in considerable distress. A suicide would typically have arranged himself more deliberately." "Then we are dealing with murder," Hardcastle announced, turning back to face the assembled passengers. His gaze moved from face to face, reading the shock, the fear, the careful blankness that might conceal guilt. "The compartment was locked from the inside," he continued. "No one could have entered or left by the door after Sir Reginald secured it. The window is too small to permit entry or exit, and in any case, the train was in motion. Which means, ladies and gentlemen, that if this is indeed murder, if the poison must have been administered before Sir Reginald entered his compartment, and by someone who had access to him at Victoria Station or earlier in the evening. He let this statement settle over the group like a shroud. I shall need detailed statements from each of you, particularly," and here his gaze fixed pointedly on Lady Constance, "from those who knew Sir Reginald personally and might have had recent contact with him." Lady Constance met his stare without flinching. "I had not seen my husband in over 2 months, Inspector. Our separation, while not amicable, had reached a state of mutual indifference. And yet you find yourself travelling on the same train, in the same carriage. The Midnight Express is not a private conveyance, Inspector. Coincidences do occur." "Indeed they do," Hardcastle replied, and his tone suggesting he placed little faith in coincidence. The questioning continued for another hour, with each passenger providing their account of the evening. The statements were remarkably consistent in their lack of useful information. No one had heard anything unusual. No one had left their compartment between departure and the discovery of the body. No one admitted to any recent contact with Sir Reginald. By 4 o'clock in the morning, with dawn still 2 hours away, Inspector Hardcastle found himself in possession of a locked room mystery, a body showing signs of poisoning, and a carriage full of potential suspects, any one of whom might have had opportunity to poison Sir Reginald before the train departed. He stood in the corridor outside compartment 3A, while staring at the locked door as though it might yield its secrets through force of will alone. "A pretty puzzle," murmured Dr. Bellamy, who had joined him in the corridor. "A devilish one," Hardcastle agreed, "but I've dealt with poisoners before. They always make a mistake, always leave a trail. By morning, I'll have the answer." Dr. Bellamy nodded slowly, but his expression remained thoughtful and somewhat troubled. Neither man could know that the answer would not come from Scotland Yard's laboratories or Inspector Hardcastle's dogged questioning. It would come instead from an unexpected quarter, from a small, dapper Belgian gentleman with magnificent moustaches and a reputation for employing what he called the little grey cells. It would come from Hercule Poirot. But Poirot's involvement in the affair would not begin until several hours later, when the sun had risen over the Kent countryside and the midnight express to Dover had been transformed from a luxury conveyance into a crime scene on rails. For now, in the pre-dawn darkness, with fog still pressing against the windows and the body of Sir Reginald Ashcroft growing cold in compartment 3A, the mystery remained impenetrable. Someone aboard this train was a murderer. Someone had committed the perfect crime, or so they believed. The morning arrived with reluctant grey light filtering through the fog that still clung to the railway tracks at Bromley South Station. The midnight express sat motionless on the platform, its elegant facade now marred by the presence of police constables stationed at every door. Inside the first-class carriage, none of the 6 passengers had been confined to the sitting room under the watchful eye of a young officer whose boyish face struggled to maintain an expression of stern authority. They made an incongruous tableau in the harsh light of morning. Lady Constance Ashcroft had dressed with meticulous care, her black travelling suit now buttoned to the throat, her silver blonde hair arranged in an elegant chignon that suggested hours before a mirror rather than a sleepless night on a stationary train. She sat apart from the others, her posture erect, her hands folded in her lap with the stillness of a woman accustomed to maintaining appearances under scrutiny. Only the faint shadows beneath her eyes betrayed the strain of the night's events. Across from her, Doctor? The Marquis Bellamy had produced a small leather-bound volume from his medical bag and appeared to be reading, though his eyes had not moved from the same page for the past 20 minutes. He was a man of distinguished appearance, with iron-grey hair and the kind of face that inspired confidence in his patients, strong features softened by an expression of habitual sympathy. His suit was well tailored but not ostentatious, his manner professional and controlled. Yet there was something in the set of his shoulders, a tension that had nothing to do with the cramped quarters or the uncomfortable circumstances. Miss Evelyn Carruthers had wept intermittently throughout the early morning hours, her thin frame shaking with sobs that seemed disproportionate to her claimed lack of connection to the deceased. She clutched her handkerchief in knotted fingers, her mousy brown hair escaping from its pins, her eyes red-rimmed behind wire-framed spectacles. She had the apologetic demeanor of one who felt herself perpetually in the way, an inconvenience to others, and her discovery of the body seemed to have confirmed her worst fears about drawing attention to herself. Mr. Julian Merrick, by contrast, wore his dishevelment with a certain rakish charm. He had not bothered to complete his toilette, his shirt open at the collar, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a manner that might have been artfully arranged or genuinely careless. He was handsome in the modern style, with sharp cheekbones and eyes of an unusual amber color that gave him a vaguely feline appearance. He had attempted conversation several times during the long night, making light remarks that fell flat in the oppressive atmosphere, until finally subsiding into a restless silence punctuated by frequent glances at his wrist-watch. Mrs. Daphne Pemberton and her companion Miss Lily Hartwell remained close together on the settee, though their proximity seemed to emphasize rather than diminish the gulf between them. Mrs. Pemberton was a handsome woman with the kind of beauty that money maintains past its natural expiration. Her skin carefully preserved, her figure corseted into fashionable slimness, her clothing expensive without being vulgar. She wore pearls at her throat and rings on 3 fingers, and her expression alternated between irritation at the inconvenience and a poorly concealed excitement at being involved in such a dramatic event. Miss Hartwell was her opposite in almost every respect. Young, danced with the kind of natural prettiness that required no artifice. She wore a simple grey dress and no jewelry save a small silver locket at her throat. Her dark eyes were large and perpetually startled, like those of a deer that has wandered into an unfamiliar clearing. She spoke only when addressed directly, and then in barely audible whispers, her hands twisting in her lap in unconscious mimicry of Miss Carruthers's nervous gesture. Inspector Hardcastle entered the sitting room at 7:30, his face drawn from lack of sleep but his manner bristling with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has solved a difficult problem. He carried a small leather case, which he placed on the table with deliberate emphasis. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I've made considerable progress in my investigation. Now, Sir Reginald Ashcroft died of cyanide poisoning, administered sometime between 9 o'clock yesterday evening and the departure of the train. The poison was delivered in a flask of brandy found in his compartment, a flask which, according to his valet, whom I interviewed by telephone, Sir Reginald always carried on train journeys, but filled immediately before departure from his private stock at his London residence." He paused, allowing this information to settle over the assembly, his gaze moving from face to face with the deliberate pace of a man cataloguing reactions. "This means," he continued, "that someone had access to Sir Reginald's brandy flask yesterday evening before he boarded this train. Someone who knew his habits, someone who had both opportunity and motive to wish him dead. And I've made inquiries into the background of each of you, and I have discovered connections to the deceased that some of you failed to mention in your initial statements. I believe I know who murdered Sir Reginald Ashcroft, and I intend to make an arrest within the hour." The pronouncement hung in the air like smoke. Lady Constance's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. Dr. Bellamy closed his book with a soft snap. Miss Carruthers drew in a sharp breath that might have been a gasp or a sob. Mr. Merrick leaned forward with sudden interest, while Mrs. Pemberton clutched her companion's arm with jeweled fingers. Inspector Hardcastle allowed the silence to stretch, savoring his moment of theatrical revelation. And he had opened the leather case and now withdrew several sheets of paper covered in neat handwriting. "Let us review what I have discovered," he said, consulting his notes. "Lady Constance Ashcroft, you stated that you had not seen your husband in over 2 months. Yet my inquiries reveal that you met with Sir Reginald at his London club just 3 days ago, where witnesses report a heated argument in which you were heard to say, and I quote, 'You will regret this, Reginald. I swear you will regret this.' Would you care to revise your statement?" Lady Constance's lips compressed into a thin line. When she spoke, her voice was ice. "Very well. Yes, I met with Reginald. We argued about financial matters. He was attempting to reduce my settlement, to cut me off without a penny. I was angry. I made an intemperate remark. But I did not kill my husband, Inspector. Despite everything, I'm not a murderer." "Perhaps not," Hardcastle said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Dr. Bellamy, you claimed no previous acquaintance with Sir Reginald. Yet I've learned that 6 months ago, Sir Reginald made a formal complaint to the General Medical Council regarding your treatment of a patient who subsequently died under circumstances that some might consider questionable. That complaint could have ended your career, Doctor. It still might, pending the Council's investigation." Dr. Bellamy's composure finally cracked. Color rose in his cheeks, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge of barely controlled anger. Sir Reginald's complaint was malicious and unfounded. The patient in question was his own nephew, a young man suffering from consumption, and I did everything medically possible to save him. Sir Reginald blamed me for a death that was inevitable, and he sought to ruin me out of spite and grief. Yes, I had reason to hate him, but I am a physician, Inspector. I took an oath to preserve life, not to take it. Hardcastle made a notation on his papers, his expression skeptical. He turned his attention to Miss Carruthers, who shrank back in her seat as though hoping to disappear into the upholstery. "Miss Carruthers, you presented yourself as a mere governess with no connection to the deceased. Yet 15 years ago, you were employed by the Ashcroft family as governess to their daughter, Caroline. You were dismissed without references under circumstances that were never fully explained. Caroline Ashcroft died by her own hand 2 years later. Did Sir Reginald blame you for failing to prevent that tragedy?" Miss Carruthers's face had gone white. "I loved Caroline like my own daughter," she whispered. "Her death destroyed me. Sir Reginald did blame me, yes. He said I should have seen the signs, should have prevented it, sir, but I was only her governess, Inspector. I had no authority, no power to help her when she needed it most. Sir Reginald turned me out, blackened my name, made it impossible for me to find decent employment. I've lived in poverty because of him, yes, but I did not kill him. I could not." The inspector's methodical dismantling of their statements continued. Mr. Merrick, it transpired, was not merely an art dealer, but Sir Reginald's former business partner, cheated out of a considerable sum in a gallery venture that had bankrupted him 3 years prior. Mrs. Pemberton had been engaged to Sir Reginald's son before the young man died in the Great War, and she had never forgiven Sir Reginald for buying his son a commission in a regiment that saw immediate front-line service. Even young Miss Hartwell, it emerged, was not merely a paid companion, but the illegitimate daughter of Sir Reginald's deceased brother, cut off from any family inheritance by Sir Reginald's machinations. "You see," Hardcastle said with grim satisfaction, "each of you had motive, each of you had reason to wish Sir Reginald Ashcroft dead. But only one of you had both motive and opportunity. Only one of you was in a position to poison his brandy flask before he boarded this train." He paused, his gaze fixing on Lady Constance with the intensity of a hunting dog that has cornered its prey. "Lady Ashcroft, you met with your husband 3 days ago. You knew his habits, knew about the brandy flask. You had access to his London residence where the flask would have been filled. You stood to inherit his entire fortune despite your separation, provided he did not live long enough to finalize the new will he was drafting. I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Ashcroft." Lady Constance rose to her feet with the deliberate grace of a woman ascending a scaffold. Her face remained composed, though 2 spots of color had appeared high on her cheekbones. "You're making a grave mistake, Inspector," she said quietly. "I did not kill my husband. The evidence suggests otherwise, Lady Ashcroft. If you will come with me. 1 moment, if you please." The voice came from the doorway, and every head turned toward it. The man who stood there was small, hardly more than 5 feet 4 inches in height, with a head shaped like an egg and a pair of magnificent mustaches waxed to perfect symmetry. He wore a dark suit of impeccable cut, a bow tie arranged with mathematical precision, and carried a silver-topped walking stick. His eyes, bright and green, surveyed the scene with an expression of courteous interest. "And who the devil are you?" demanded Inspector Hardcastle, his face reddening with indignation at the interruption. "I am Hercule Poirot," the small man announced, stepping into the sitting room with the delicate precision of a cat navigating unfamiliar furniture. "I've been asked by Scotland Yard to assist in this matter. They were most insistent that I take the next train from London, which I did, though it was most inconvenient to my breakfast routine. The superintendent, he knows my little reputation, yes?" Hardcastle's expression suggested he knew nothing of the sort, and cared even less. "This is a matter for the Kent Constabulary. I have conducted a thorough investigation and identified the guilty party. Your services, whatever they may be, are not required." Poirot removed his gloves with fastidious care, folding them and placing them in his pocket. "But I think perhaps they are required, Inspector. You have been most efficient, most thorough in your questioning. I have read the statements you took during the night. The officer at the station was kind enough to provide me with copies. Very detailed, very complete. And yet, I think there are 1 or 2 small points that deserve the attention. To know?" "Such as?" Hardcastle's tone was hostile, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Such as the locked compartment," Poirot said gently. "You have established that Sir Reginald locked his door from the inside at 11:43, 2 minutes before departure. The conductor confirms this. And yet, the poison, you say it was administered between 9 o'clock and the departure of the train. Tell me, Inspector, Where was Sir Reginald between 9 o'clock and 11:43? Hardcastle consulted his notes, slightly flustered. At his club, the Marlborough. He dined there, according to the staff I interviewed by telephone. Ah, and the brandy flask. It was with him at the club. Presumably in his coat pocket. That's where his valet says he always kept it. Presumably, Poirot repeated softly, and his tone making the words sound like a criticism. But you did not verify this. You did not ask the club staff whether they observed Sir Reginald drinking from his flask during the evening? That seemed unnecessary. The valet confirmed his habits. Habits, yes. But on this particular evening, did he follow those habits? Poirot's eyes moved around the room, taking in each face with the intensity of a jeweler examining stones for flaws. You see, it is possible, just possible, that the brandy flask was poisoned not at his residence, not at his club, but here, on this very train, before Sir Reginald locked his door. Impossible, Hardcastle said flatly. The compartment was locked from the inside. No one could have entered. No one could have entered after the door was locked, this is true. But before, says in those 2 minutes between 11:41, when the conductor saw Sir Reginald board the train, and 11:43, when he confirmed the door was locked. 2 minutes is a very short time, Inspector, but it is long enough for someone to knock on a compartment door, to be admitted briefly, to add poison to a brandy flask that sits perhaps on the small table, and to depart. Sir Reginald, he would lock his door afterward, thinking himself quite secure. A profound silence had fallen over the sitting room. The passengers sat frozen, their attention fixed on the small Belgian detective whose quiet words had demolished Hardcastle's certainty as efficiently as a hammer striking glass. But that would mean, Hardcastle said slowly, that the murderer was someone already aboard the train, someone in this very carriage. Précisément, Poirot agreed. Someone who knew which compartment Sir Reginald occupied. Someone who had access to cyanide. Someone who could enter his compartment briefly without arousing suspicion. His gaze swept the assembled group once more. Someone among these 6 people who sit before us now. Inspector Hardcastle's face had gone from red to pale in the space of 30 seconds. He stared at Poirot with the expression of a man who has just watched his carefully constructed house of cards collapse. But Lady Ashcroft still had the best opportunity. She knew her husband's habits, had access to his residence. And so did many others, perhaps, Poirot interrupted gently. But let us not theorize before we have the facts, Inspector. It is a cardinal error to construct theories without data. Instead, may I suggest that we examine the scene of the crime, and perhaps afterward I might conduct my own small interviews with these ladies and gentlemen. Not to contradict your excellent work, you understand, but to supplement it with a few details that may have escaped attention. Hardcastle's pride wrestled briefly with his uncertainty. Pride lost. Very well, Monsieur Poirot, though I maintain that Lady Ashcroft remains the prime suspect. But of course, Poirot said soothingly, we shall keep all possibilities open, yes? The examination of compartment 3A was conducted with Poirot's characteristic thoroughness. He stood in the doorway for a full minute, simply observing, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly to one side. Then he entered, moving with the precision of a dancer, touching nothing but observing everything. The body had been removed to the station morgue, but the compartment remained otherwise undisturbed. The brandy flask sat on the small table beneath the window, a silver vessel engraved with Sir Reginald's initials. Beside it lay a crystal glass, empty save for a few drops of amber liquid clinging to the bottom. A leather attaché case rested on the seat, its contents, various business papers and contracts, spread out as though Sir Reginald had been reviewing them before his death. Poirot bent low over the brandy flask, sniffing delicately without touching it. The bitter almond smell, yes. Unmistakable. Cyanide, as Dr. Bellamy suggested. He straightened, his eyes moving to the glass. And Sir Reginald, he poured himself a drink, perhaps to steady his nerves for the journey. "One drink only, you see, Inspector. The flask is still nearly full." "What of it?" Hardcastle asked. "Simply that one drink of poisoned brandy should not have killed him so quickly. Cyanide acts rapidly, yes, but the amount in a single glass of brandy, unless the concentration was very high, should have given him time to call for help, to unlock his door, to create some commotion, and yet the conductor heard nothing. No one heard anything. Sir Reginald died in complete silence." Poirot moved to the window, examining the catch, then to the door, studying the lock mechanism with the intensity of a watchmaker examining a complicated movement. He knelt, with some difficulty, for his knees were not what they once were, and examined the floor, the carpet, the space beneath the seat. "What do you see, Monsieur Poirot?" Hardcastle asked, unable to conceal his curiosity. "What I do not see is most interesting," Poirot replied, rising carefully to his feet. "I do not see any sign of disturbance, any indication that Sir Reginald suspected he was in danger. A man who locks his door for privacy and security does not expect to be poisoned. He feels safe, and yet someone succeeded in introducing poison into his brandy. How?" He returned to the table, circling it slowly. The attaché case was open, the papers spread out. Sir Reginald was working, perhaps preparing for business meetings on the continent. A man absorbed in his work, a man who pours himself a drink without thinking, without examining it closely. A man who would not notice if the brandy tasted slightly bitter, for brandy has its own strong flavor. "You're suggesting the poison was added after he boarded?" Hardcastle said. "I am suggesting it as a possibility that must be explored." Poirot moved toward the door, then paused. "Tell me, Inspector, have you examined the other compartments? The one belonging to Dr. Bellamy, for instance, who has access to many chemicals and would know precisely how much cyanide would be required. Or perhaps Miss Carruthers, whose compartment shares a wall with this one. Or Mr. Merrick, who strikes me as a man of considerable resourcefulness." "I had intended to conduct a thorough search once Lady Ashcroft was formally arrested." But perhaps we should conduct that search now, before anything can be concealed or disposed of, yes? With your permission, Inspector, I should like to examine each compartment in turn. And perhaps we shall find something that will illuminate this dark puzzle." Hardcastle nodded reluctantly. "Very well. But I'll accompany you. And Constable Briggs will remain with the passengers to ensure no one attempts to leave or interfere with potential evidence." "An excellent precaution," Poirot approved. "Come then, Inspector. Let us see what secrets these compartments may reveal. For somewhere in this carriage there is evidence that will point unmistakably to the murderer. It is simply a matter of knowing where to look, and more importantly, how to see." The search began with compartment 3B, occupied by Dr. Marcus Bellamy. The physician had been required to surrender his medical bag, which sat on the narrow seat like an accusation. Poirot examined it with meticulous care, removing each item and placing it on the small fold-down table. There were the usual instruments of a general practitioner: stethoscope, thermometer, the tongue depressors, various bottles of medicine with neatly handwritten labels. "Digitalis, laudanum, aspirin powder, iodine," Poirot read aloud. "All quite ordinary for a medical man, yes? But no cyanide, I observe." "A doctor would hardly carry poison openly," Hardcastle pointed out. "Perhaps not. But if he used cyanide from his own supply, where did he obtain it, and where is the container now?" Poirot's fingers moved deftly through the bag's compartments. "See here, Inspector, how neatly everything is arranged. Dr. Bellamy, he is a man of order, of method. Each bottle in its place, each instrument wrapped in its cloth. Such a man would not dispose carelessly of evidence. He would plan, would prepare, would ensure no trace remained." He turned his attention to the compartment itself, examining the washstand, the luggage, out even the upholstery. Nothing. The compartment was as impersonal as a hotel room, containing no hint of guilt or deception. Miss Carruthers's compartment presented a stark contrast. Where Dr. Bellamy's space suggested disciplined efficiency, hers spoke of genteel poverty and nervous disorder. Her clothes were carefully mended but worn, her toiletries cheap and sparse. A well-thumbed Bible lay on the seat, and a small framed photograph showed a young girl with serious eyes. Caroline Ashcroft, presumably, the daughter whose death had haunted Miss Carruthers for 15 years. Poirot picked up the photograph with gentle hands, studying it. She was beautiful, this child. One can see the sadness in her eyes even then. Miss Carruthers must have loved her very much to carry this picture all these years. Guilt, Hardcastle suggested. She feels responsible for the girl's death. Perhaps genuine affection. Poirot replaced the photograph carefully. But again, no poison, no evidence of planning or preparation. Miss Carruthers, she strikes me as a woman who acts from emotion, not calculation. Poison requires planning, coldness, patience. I do not see these qualities here. Lady Constance's compartment was, as expected, a study in elegant restraint. Her luggage was expensive leather, her clothing impeccably maintained. A jewelry case contained several valuable pieces: pearls, a diamond brooch, sapphire earrings. Poirot examined each item with interest. A wealthy woman, he observed. One who would inherit more wealth upon her husband's death, yes? The motive, it is certainly present. But where is the means? Where is the opportunity? He opened her vanity case, revealing cosmetics, perfumes, a silver-backed brush and mirror. Nothing that could contain poison, nothing out of place. Mr. Merrick's compartment told a different story. Despite his polished exterior, his possessions suggested a man living on the edge of financial ruin. His suits were expensive but outdated, his luggage of good quality but worn. Among his papers, Poirot discovered a sheaf of unpaid bills and a letter from a solicitor, warning of impending bankruptcy proceedings. So, Mr. Merrick, he is in desperate need of money, Poirot murmured. And Sir Reginald cheated him of a considerable sum 3 years ago. Revenge and financial necessity, a powerful combination of motives. But again, no poison, Hardcastle said with growing frustration. "'Tis no poison that we can see," Poirot corrected gently. The final compartment belonged to Mrs. Pemberton and Miss Hartwell. The contrast between the two women's possessions was striking. Mrs. Pemberton's belongings occupied most of the space. Multiple cases of clothing, cosmetics, arranged like a shop display, a jewel box that rivaled Lady Constance's in value. Miss Hartwell's possessions consisted of a single small valise containing 2 changes of clothing and a few personal items of negligible value. Poirot examined the jewel box with particular interest. Mrs. Pemberton, she is fond of adornment, I see. And yet there is something here that interests me very much. He withdrew a small silver locket from among the rings and bracelets. This piece, it is not like the others. See, Inspector, it is old, tarnished, as in the silver is of inferior quality. Why would a wealthy woman who owns diamonds and pearls keep such a trinket? He opened the locket carefully. Inside was a miniature photograph of a young man in military uniform, handsome, with something of Sir Reginald's features in the set of his jaw, in the shape of his eyes. Her fiancé, Hardcastle said. Sir Reginald's son, the one who died in the war. Yes, and she has kept this all these years, through remarriage and widowhood. The grief, it does not fade for some people. It festers. Poirot returned to the sitting room where the 6 passengers remained under the watchful eye of Constable Briggs. They looked up as he entered, their faces reflecting varying degrees of anxiety, curiosity, and exhaustion. The morning had advanced to midday, and weak sunlight now filtered through the fog, casting pale shadows across the velvet upholstery. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, settling himself into a chair with careful precision. "I have examined your compartments, and I have found nothing, which is, in itself, most revealing. The absence of evidence can be as telling as its presence, no. But now I wish to speak with each of you individually. Not to accuse, you understand, but to clarify certain small details that trouble me." Inspector Hardcastle had positioned himself by the door, his arms folded across his chest, his expression skeptical, but attentive. Poirot ignored him, focusing instead on Lady Constance. "Madame, if you would be so kind as to answer a few questions. Your meeting with Sir Reginald 3 days ago, you argued about financial matters, you said. Can you be more specific?" Lady Constance's voice remained controlled, though fatigue had begun to show in the fine lines around her eyes. "Reginald was attempting to alter our separation agreement. He claimed I had been living extravagantly on the allowance he provided. He threatened to reduce it by half and to contest any inheritance claims I might make upon his death. I told him I would fight him in court if necessary. And you were heard to say, 'You will regret this.' A threatening statement, some might think. I meant legal action, Monsieur Poirot. Nothing more sinister than solicitors and courtrooms." "Of course. And did Sir Reginald seem concerned for his safety? Did he mention enemies, threats, anything that suggested he feared for his life?" Lady Constance paused, considering. "Now that you mention it, he did seem preoccupied, distracted. He kept checking his watch and glancing toward the door of his club as though expecting someone. But he said nothing of threats or danger." Poirot nodded thoughtfully and turned his attention to Dr. Bellamy. "Doctor, this complaint Sir Reginald made to the medical council, it must have caused you considerable distress, yes? Your reputation, your livelihood, all threatened by one man's vindictive accusation." Dr. Bellamy's hands tightened on his knees. "It was devastating. I've practiced medicine for 27 years without a single complaint. And then, because I could not save a young man whose lungs were already destroyed by consumption, I was accused of negligence, of incompetence. Sir Reginald was mad with grief and needed someone to blame." "The hearing before the council, when is it scheduled?" "Next month. And I've retained a solicitor, gathered testimony from other physicians who reviewed the case. I'm confident I will be exonerated. Or, rather, I was confident. Now, with Sir Reginald dead and me present on this train, the timing will look suspicious. The council may wonder if I eliminated the primary witness against me." "A valid concern," Poirot agreed. "Tell me, did you see Sir Reginald board the train last night? Did you speak with him?" "I saw him in the corridor briefly. We did not speak. I went directly to my compartment and remained there until the commotion began." Poirot turned next to Miss Carruthers, softening his voice to a gentler tone. "Mademoiselle, forgive me for asking, but your dismissal from the Ashcroft household 15 years ago, what were the circumstances exactly?" Miss Carruthers twisted her handkerchief between her fingers. "Caroline confided in me about her unhappiness. Her father was a tyrant who controlled every aspect of her life. She wanted to marry a young man Sir Reginald deemed unsuitable, a school teacher with no fortune. I encouraged her to follow her heart. When Sir Reginald discovered this, he dismissed me immediately and forbade Caroline from ever seeing the young man again. 6 months later, she threw herself from her bedroom window." "How terrible," Poirot murmured. "And you blame yourself?" "Every day," she whispered. "If I had not encouraged her, if I had counseled patience instead of rebellion, she might still be alive. Or she might have been miserable for the remainder of her days," Poirot said quietly. "One cannot know. Tell me, did you arrange to be on this particular train, knowing Sir Reginald would be aboard?" Her eyes widened behind her spectacles. "No. I had no idea he would be traveling to Dover. It was pure coincidence." Poirot's expression suggested he found coincidence a poor explanation for much, but he moved on to Mr. Merrick. "Monsieur, your financial difficulties are considerable, I understand. The art gallery Sir Reginald helped you establish. What happened to it? Merrick's jaw tightened. Sir Reginald promised to invest £20,000. I used his name to secure premises, acquire inventory, hire staff. Then he withdrew his investment without warning, claiming the venture was too risky. I was left with debts I could not pay. The gallery closed within 6 months. I lost everything. Poirot leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. And yet, Monsieur Merrick, despite this catastrophic loss, you have continued in the art business, no? I observed among your possessions several catalogues from auction houses, correspondence with galleries on the continent. You are traveling to Dover for business purposes. Merrick's amber eyes flickered with something that might have been calculation or merely weariness. I have managed to rebuild in a modest way. I act as a broker now, connecting buyers with sellers, taking a small commission. It is hardly the grand enterprise I once envisioned, but it allows me to survive. And Sir Reginald, did he know you would be on this train? I have no idea, and we had not spoken in 3 years. I avoided him deliberately. Seeing him would have been too painful, too humiliating. Poirot nodded slowly, his green eyes thoughtful. He turned his attention to Mrs. Pemberton, who had been watching the proceedings with barely concealed fascination, as though observing a particularly engrossing theatrical performance. Madame Pemberton, the young man whose photograph you carry in the locket, Sir Reginald's son. You were to be married, yes? We were engaged when war was declared, Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice taking on a rehearsed quality as though she had told this story many times before. James was 23, full of idealism and patriotic fervor. His father purchased him a commission in the Guards, and James shipped to France in September of 1914. He was killed at First Ypres 2 months later, and I mourned him for 3 years before marrying Mr. Pemberton, a much older man who provided security, if not romance. And you blamed Sir Reginald for his son's death. I blamed him for sending James to war like a lamb to slaughter. Sir Reginald could have used his influence to secure James a staff position, something safer. Instead, he insisted his son must prove himself in combat, must uphold the family honor. James died for that honor, Monsieur Poirot. He died in mud and blood and agony, and for what? So his father could boast of having a hero for a son. The bitterness in her voice was corrosive, eating through her polished veneer. Poirot observed her with sympathy, but also with intense scrutiny. You have remarried, been widowed, yet you still carry this locket. The grief, it remains fresh after all these years. Some wounds never heal, monsieur. Surely you understand that. I understand many things, madame. For instance, I understand that your late husband left you a considerable fortune. Enough that you need not work, need not worry about financial security. And yet you have taken on a companion, Miss Hartwell. Why? Mrs. Pemberton's hand moved unconsciously toward the young woman beside her, a gesture that seemed almost protective. I am alone in the world, Monsieur Poirot. My husband's family has no interest in me. I desired companionship, someone intelligent and refined to accompany me on my travels. Poirot shifted his gaze to Miss Hartwell, who seemed to shrink under his attention. And you, mademoiselle, you are Sir Reginald's niece, I understand. Though born on what the world calls the wrong side of the blanket, Miss Hartwell's voice emerged barely above a whisper. My father was Sir Reginald's younger brother. He died when I was 3. My mother raised me alone, working as a seamstress. When she died 2 years ago, I wrote to Sir Reginald, hoping he might acknowledge me as family, perhaps provide some small assistance. He refused even to reply. Mrs. Pemberton hired me 6 months ago when my situation became desperate. Did Sir Reginald know you were employed by Mrs. Pemberton? I don't believe so. I used my mother's maiden name, Hartwell, rather than my father's name. I wanted nothing from Sir Reginald except to be left alone. Yet here you are, on the same train, traveling in the same carriage. A coincidence? Miss Hartwell insisted, though her voice trembled. I had no knowledge Sir Reginald would be aboard." Poirot rose from his chair and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. The assembled group watched him with the fixed attention of students before an unpredictable examiner. "So," he said at length, "we have 6 people, all with connections to Sir Reginald Ashcroft, all with grievances against him, all conveniently present on this train. Lady Constance threatened with financial ruin. Dr. Bellamy facing professional disgrace. Miss Carruthers never forgiven for a tragedy that occurred 15 years ago. Mr. Merrick bankrupted and humiliated. Mrs. Pemberton harboring decades of grief and resentment. And Miss Hartwell rejected and denied her birthright. 6 people, 6 motives. And one of you, I think, not decided that justice delayed had become justice denied." Inspector Hardcastle stirred from his position by the door. "So you agree with my assessment? Lady Ashcroft remains the most likely suspect." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Ah, Inspector, I agree with nothing yet. For you see, there is something that troubles me very much about this murder. Something that does not fit the pattern." Inspector Hardcastle's face registered irritation. "What doesn't fit? The evidence clearly points to poisoning. The brandy flask contained cyanide. Sir Reginald drank from it and died. What could be simpler?" Poirot held up one finger, a gesture that commanded attention despite its smallness. "What troubles me, Inspector, is the timing. Consider, Sir Reginald locks his door at 11:43. By 1:15 he is dead, his body already cooling. That suggests he died perhaps between midnight and 1 o'clock. Yet cyanide, even in lethal doses, acts within minutes, not hours. Why would Sir Reginald wait so long before drinking from his flask? Perhaps he was absorbed in his work, Hardcastle suggested. You yourself noted the papers spread on his table. But here is what I observe. The papers are spread out, yes, but there is no pen, no pencil, no notation upon them. A man reviewing business documents makes notes, marks passages, writes calculations in the margins. These papers show none of that. They are arranged as if for show, not for work. The passengers exchanged glances, uncertainty rippling through the group like wind across water. Poirot continued his pacing, his voice taking on a meditative quality. And there is the matter of the flask itself. Sir Reginald's valet confirms he filled it from his private stock yesterday evening before departing for his club. The club steward reports Sir Reginald dined there between 8 and 10 o'clock, but was not observed drinking from any personal flask. He took brandy from the club's own supply with his coffee, so the flask remained in his pocket, presumably untouched, until he boarded the train. Which means the poison was added at his residence before he left, Hardcastle said triumphantly. My original theory stands. Does it? Poirot stopped pacing and fixed the inspector with an intense stare. Then answer me this. Why did the murderer not simply increase the concentration of poison to ensure immediate death? Why leave such uncertainty? A man who locks himself in a compartment and then collapses might still cry out. They might summon help before the poison completes its work. It is sloppy, inefficient, and yet this murder, in every other respect, shows considerable planning and sophistication. Dr. Bellamy leaned forward, his professional interest engaged. Monsieur Poirot makes an excellent point. The dosage seems calibrated to ensure death, but not immediate collapse. Almost as though the murderer wanted Sir Reginald to have time to lock his door, to settle in before the poison took effect. Precisely, Poirot exclaimed. Dr. Bellamy, you have the medical knowledge. Is such precise calculation possible? With cyanide? Difficult, but not impossible. The poison could have been mixed with something to delay absorption. Certain oils or fats might slow its passage into the bloodstream. Or perhaps it was added to something Sir Reginald would consume slowly rather than all at once. Poirot turned sharply toward the doctor. Added to something. Not the brandy itself, but something else. But what else was in the compartment that Sir Reginald might have consumed? There was nothing, Hardcastle protested. We examined the compartment thoroughly. Only the flask and the glass. Nothing visible, Poirot corrected. But what about something consumed before entering the compartment? What did Sir Reginald eat or drink at his club? Hardcastle consulted his notes with renewed urgency. The club steward reported he had the usual roast beef, potatoes, Brussels sprouts, trifle for dessert, and brandy with coffee. All served from communal dishes, yes? And nothing that could have been specifically prepared for Sir Reginald alone? Correct. The club doesn't provide individual meals. Everything is served from silver chafing dishes on the sideboard. Poirot's expression showed both frustration and excitement, the look of a man who feels the solution hovering just beyond his grasp. Then we must look elsewhere. What did Sir Reginald do between leaving his club and boarding the train? Surely there was a gap of time, an opportunity for contact with someone. Lady Constance spoke suddenly, her voice cutting through the speculation. He went to his solicitor's office. I know because my own solicitor mentioned it. They share chambers in Lincoln's Inn. Sir Reginald had an appointment at 10:30 to discuss the revision of his will. Ah, Poirot's eyes gleamed. And who would know about this appointment besides the solicitors themselves? Anyone with a financial interest in Sir Reginald's estate, Mr. Merrick said quietly, which would include most of us in this room. Indeed, Poirot agreed. But more importantly, it establishes Sir Reginald's movements and provides another opportunity for poison to be administered. Inspector, you must telephone this solicitor immediately. I wish to know everyone who was present in those chambers between 10:30 and 11 o'clock last evening. Every clerk, every visitor, everyone. Hardcastle nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. But even if we establish opportunity, we still must determine which of these suspects had access to cyanide. That narrows our field considerably. Does it? Poirot asked softly. Does it really, Inspector? Cyanide is not so difficult to obtain as you might think. Photographers use it in their developing solutions. Jewelers use it for metal cleaning. Even furriers use it for treating pelts. The question is not who could obtain it, but who did obtain it, and how they introduced it into Sir Reginald's system with such deadly precision. Inspector Hardcastle departed to make his telephone inquiries, leaving Poirot alone with the 6 suspects and the increasingly nervous Constable Briggs. The small Belgian detective resumed his seat, arranging himself with fussy precision, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from his trouser leg. The silence in the sitting room had grown oppressive, thick with unspoken accusations and barely suppressed anxiety. It was Miss Carruthers who broke first, her voice emerging as a plaintive whisper. Monsieur Poirot, surely you cannot believe all of us are equally guilty. Surely the evidence must point more strongly in one direction than another. The evidence, mademoiselle, points in every direction and no direction, Poirot replied. It is like a signpost that has been spun until it indicates nothing but confusion. This is intentional, I think. The murderer has been most clever in creating a situation where everyone appears guilty. Then perhaps no one is guilty, Mr. Merrick suggested with a bitter laugh. Perhaps Sir Reginald poisoned himself, a final act of spite to implicate all those he believed had wronged him. Poirot's head tilted, his eyes bright with interest. An intriguing theory, monsieur. But suicide does not explain the careful staging of the scene, the papers spread just so, the locked door. No, this was murder. Planned with considerable intelligence and executed with precision. What puzzles me is the why of it. Not the motive, for motives we have in abundance, but the method. Why poison? Why cyanide? Why on a train? Dr. Bellamy stroked his chin thoughtfully. A train provides a closed environment, a limited pool of suspects, but it also makes escape impossible. The murderer could not flee. They would be trapped here with the body, subject to investigation and search. Exactly so, Poirot agreed, which suggests the murderer was confident they had left no evidence, no trace that could connect them to the crime. Such confidence is either born of great skill or great foolishness. I do not believe our murderer is a fool. Mrs. Pemberton had remained silent throughout much of the questioning, but now she spoke, her voice carrying an edge of steel beneath its cultured tones. Perhaps the murderer simply didn't care if they were caught. Perhaps the act itself was more important than the consequence. Revenge can make people reckless, Monsieur Poirot. Revenge, Poirot repeated softly. Yes, revenge is a powerful motivator. But even revenge, if it is to be satisfying, requires the perpetrator to survive and witness its effects. A murderer who hangs for their crime gains no satisfaction from the death of their enemy. No, I think our murderer very much intends to escape justice. He rose again, moving to the window where the fog had finally begun to lift, revealing the grey platform and the station building beyond. Let us consider what we know with certainty. Sir Reginald Ashcroft died of cyanide poisoning sometime between midnight and 1 o'clock this morning. The poison was delivered in his brandy flask, which he carried with him throughout the evening. He locked himself in his compartment and died alone, in silence, with no one to hear his final moments. These are the facts. Everything else is speculation. Lady Constance's voice was carefully neutral. And what do these facts tell you, Monsieur Poirot? They tell me that the murderer understood Sir Reginald's habits intimately. They knew about the brandy flask, knew he would drink from it during the journey, knew he would lock his door and value his privacy. This suggests someone who had known Sir Reginald for some time, who had observed him closely. That describes everyone in this room, Mr. Merrick pointed out. Just so. But it also tells me something else. The murderer was not acting on sudden impulse. This was planned, perhaps for weeks or months. The poison had to be obtained, the opportunity had to be created, the timing had to be precise. Such planning requires patience and determination. Miss Hartwell had been sitting so quietly that her sudden movement startled everyone. She stood, her hands clasped before her, her young face pale and strained. Monsieur Poirot, I cannot bear this any longer. You speak of planning and patience, but surely you must see that some of us are simply incapable of such a crime. I am 23. I have no knowledge of poisons or how to obtain them. I have never harmed anyone in my life. Why must I sit here under suspicion of murder? Poirot regarded her with surprising gentleness. Because, mademoiselle, you were here, on this train, in this carriage, when Sir Reginald died. Your presence, like that of everyone else, must be explained. If you are innocent, and I do not say you are not, then you have nothing to fear from the truth. But the truth can be twisted, she protested. Inspector Hardcastle was ready to arrest Lady Ashcroft based on circumstantial evidence alone. What if he decides I am guilty simply because I have the misfortune of being Sir Reginald's unacknowledged niece? Inspector Hardcastle is not conducting this investigation alone, Poirot said firmly. I am here to ensure that the truth, the real truth, not a convenient fiction, is discovered. And I promise you, mademoiselle, that when I identify the murderer, there will be no doubt, no question of innocence or guilt. The evidence will be irrefutable. The atmosphere in the sitting room had grown increasingly tense when Inspector Hardcastle returned from making his telephone calls. His face bore an expression of mingled confusion and reluctant respect as he approached Poirot, who had settled himself near the window, apparently lost in contemplation of the thinning fog. Monsieur Poirot, Hardcastle began, his voice lowered so the suspects could not easily overhear. I've spoken with Sir Reginald's solicitor, Mr. Pemberton Cross. He confirms that Sir Reginald visited his chambers last evening at 10:30 to discuss revisions to his will. The meeting lasted approximately 20 minutes. According to Pemberton Cross, Sir Reginald seemed agitated, kept checking his watch, and appeared eager to conclude the business and depart. And who else was present in these chambers during Sir Reginald's visit? Only Pemberton Cross himself and a junior clerk who witnessed the preliminary documents. No one else entered or left the private office during that time. However, Hardcastle paused significantly. Pemberton Cross mentioned something peculiar. When Sir Reginald arrived, he was carrying a small package, wrapped in brown paper. He asked if he might leave it in the office safe overnight to be collected by someone the following day. The solicitor agreed, thinking nothing of it at the time. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. Most interesting. And this package, it remains in the safe. Yes. Pemberton Cross offered to describe its contents, but I thought you might wish to examine it yourself, and I've asked him to bring it here on the next train from London. Excellent, Inspector. You begin to think like a detective rather than merely a policeman. There is a difference, you comprehend? Poirot's tone was gently teasing, and Hardcastle's moustache bristled slightly, though he made no reply. Poirot turned his attention back to the assembled suspects, his green eyes moving from face to face with an intensity that made each person shift uncomfortably under his gaze. He remained silent for a long moment, as though weighing some internal calculation, then spoke with deliberate precision. I've been thinking much about this case, and certain things have become clear to me. Not yet everything, no, not yet, but enough to see the shape of the truth beneath the lies and misdirection. You see, this murder is not what it appears to be. It masquerades as one thing while being quite another. Lady Constance leaned forward slightly. What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot? I mean that we have been encouraged to believe this is a crime of opportunity. Poison added to a brandy flask, a locked compartment, a clever murderer who strikes and then fades back into anonymity. But I think it is something quite different. I think this is a crime of necessity, born not of sudden rage or opportunistic malice, but of desperate calculation. Dr. Bellamy frowned. You're speaking in riddles, monsieur. Am I? Then let me speak more plainly. Someone in this room did not come aboard the Midnight Express by chance. Someone knew Sir Reginald would be here, knew his habits, knew his movements, and planned accordingly. The question that has troubled me is this. How did the murderer ensure Sir Reginald would drink the poisoned brandy at precisely the right moment? Too early, and he might have collapsed on the platform or in the corridor. Too late, and he might have reached Dover, where the crime would be infinitely more difficult to execute. He began to pace again, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice taking on a rhythmic, almost hypnotic quality. So I asked myself, what if the murderer did not poison the brandy at all? What if that is merely what we are meant to believe? Inspector Hardcastle stared at him. But the cyanide was in the flask. We found it there. Oh, yes, the cyanide is there now. But was it there when Sir Reginald drank from the flask? That is the question that changes everything. Miss Carruthers gasped audibly. Mr. Merrick's amber eyes narrowed with sudden understanding. Mrs. Pemberton's hand moved to her throat, her fingers touching the pearls there as though seeking reassurance from something solid and real. Poirot continued, his voice soft but inexorable. Consider this scenario. Sir Reginald locks himself in his compartment. He pours himself a glass of brandy, clean, untainted brandy from his own supply. He drinks it and feels nothing amiss because there is nothing amiss. The brandy is perfectly innocent. But then, as he sits there reviewing his papers, something else happens. Something he does not expect. Something that introduces the poison into his system by a different route entirely. What route? Hardcastle demanded. You said yourself the compartment was locked from inside. No one could have entered. No one could have entered through the door. Poirot agreed. But there are other ways to reach a man in a locked compartment, Inspector. There is the window, though too small for a person. There are the walls, thin enough to hear through. And there is something else. Something I noticed when I examined compartment 3A, but did not fully appreciate until now. He moved to stand before the assembled suspects, his small figure somehow commanding despite its lack of physical impressiveness. You see, the compartments in this carriage share not only walls, but also a ventilation system. Small grills near the ceiling allow air to circulate between compartments. One could not pass a solid object through these grills, but one could pass something else. Something that might carry poison. Something like... He paused, and in that pause, one of the suspects made the smallest, most involuntary movement. It lasted perhaps half a second. A tiny flinch, an unconscious betrayal. But Poirot saw it, and his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a chess player who has seen his opponent's fatal error. "Like smoke," he concluded softly. "Cyanide can be delivered as a gas, can it not, Dr. Bellamy? Hydrogen cyanide, for instance, produced by treating cyanide salts with acid. The gas would drift through the ventilation grills, would be inhaled by the victim, would kill within minutes. And afterward, the murderer need only add liquid cyanide to the brandy flask to create the appearance of poisoning by ingestion. A brilliant misdirection." Dr. Bellamy's face had gone rigid, his professional composure cracking like fine porcelain under sudden pressure. "That's a fascinating theory, Monsieur Poirot, but entirely speculative. How would one produce hydrogen cyanide gas on a moving train without arousing suspicion? The apparatus required, the chemicals, the risk of exposure to oneself. It's preposterous." "Is it?" Poirot's voice remained gentle, almost conversational. "A medical man would have access to the necessary chemicals. A small vial of potassium cyanide, easily concealed. A few drops of sulfuric acid, which you carry in your medical bag for cauterizing purposes, as I observed during my search. Mix them together in a sealed container with a tube leading to the ventilation grill, and voila. Hydrogen cyanide gas flows silently into the adjacent compartment. The victim inhales, collapses, dies in minutes. The apparatus is then dismantled. Now the components disposed of or hidden among ordinary medical supplies. Who would question a physician carrying chemicals and glassware?" The color had drained from Dr. Bellamy's face, but his voice remained steady. "You have no proof of this wild accusation." "Do I not?" Poirot tilted his head. "Let us consider the evidence systematically. First, you claim to have no connection to Sir Reginald beyond his complaint to the medical council. Yet when I examined your compartment, I found among your possessions a photograph, tucked inside your medical journal, as though you wished to keep it close, yet hidden. A photograph of a young man bearing a striking resemblance to Sir Reginald. Your son, I think, Doctor. The son Sir Reginald's nephew might have been, had circumstances been different." Dr. Bellamy's hands clenched on the arms of his chair, those knuckles white. "But no," Poirot continued, "I have reasoned incorrectly. Not your son. Your nephew, perhaps. Or," his eyes grew sharp, "your patient's brother. Let me reconstruct the truth. The young man who died of consumption, Sir Reginald's nephew whom you treated, he had a brother, yes? A brother who perhaps witnessed what he believed was medical negligence, who blamed you as Sir Reginald blamed you, but who later discovered the truth. That his brother's death was not your fault, but rather the result of Sir Reginald's interference. Sir Reginald, who refused to pay for the expensive sanatorium treatment that might have saved the young man's life, who insisted on cheaper home care, who prioritized his fortune over his nephew's survival." Miss Hartwell had risen to her feet, her face ashen, her voice breaking. "No, please, oh no." Poirot turned to her with infinite sadness. "Yes, mademoiselle. Your brother, your twin brother, I think, for the photograph shows a young man of your age. He died not because Dr. Bellamy failed him, but because Sir Reginald refused to spend money on family he considered illegitimate, unworthy of the Ashcroft name. And you, in your grief and rage, sought revenge. But you could not do it alone. You needed help, needed someone with medical knowledge, someone who also had reason to hate Sir Reginald." "This is absurd," Mrs. Pemberton interjected, but her voice lacked conviction. "Miss Hartwell is my companion. She had no connection to Dr. Bellamy." "Did she not?" Poirot's gaze swiveled to Mrs. Pemberton. "But I think she did, madame. I think you introduced them, you who have nursed grief for James Ashcroft for 20 years, who never forgave Sir Reginald for sending your fiancé to his death. You learned of Miss Hartwell's existence, learned of her brother's death, and you saw an opportunity. Not for yourself to commit murder. No, you're too clever for that. But to facilitate it, to bring together two people who had cause to hate Sir Reginald and the means to destroy him. Inspector Hardcastle had been listening with growing alarm. Are you suggesting a conspiracy? 3 people working together? Not 3, Poirot said quietly. 2. Dr. Bellamy and Miss Hartwell. Mrs. Pemberton merely provided the introduction. Perhaps unknowingly, perhaps not. But the planning, the execution, that was Dr. Bellamy's expertise and Miss Hartwell's determination. Miss Hartwell's composure shattered entirely. She sank back onto the settee, tears streaming down her face. He killed my brother, not with his own hands, but through cruelty and indifference. Thomas begged him for help, begged him for the treatment that might save his life. Sir Reginald refused. He said illegitimate spawn had no claim on Ashcroft money. Thomas died in agony, drowning in his own lungs, and Sir Reginald felt nothing. Nothing! Dr. Bellamy reached toward her instinctively, then stopped himself, his expression one of profound anguish. I treated your brother with everything available to me, he said softly. But without proper sanatorium care, without the expensive medications, I could only ease his suffering, not cure him. When Sir Reginald blamed me, accused me of negligence, I wanted to expose his own culpability. But who would believe me against a man of his wealth and position? So you decided on a different form of justice, Poirot said. Together, you planned Sir Reginald's death with meticulous care. The silence that followed Poirot's words was profound, broken only by Miss Hartwell's quiet sobbing. Dr. Bellamy sat motionless, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Defiance, resignation, and something that might have been relief. Inspector Hardcastle had moved closer, his hand near his pocket where presumably he carried handcuffs, waiting for Poirot to complete his exposition. Poirot settled himself into his chair once more, arranging his position with characteristic precision. Let me tell you how it was done, for the method was ingenious. Miss Hartwell, you took employment with Mrs. Pemberton 6 months ago, so this was not coincidence. You sought her out deliberately, knowing she had reason to hate Sir Reginald, hoping perhaps to find an ally. Mrs. Pemberton, whether through genuine sympathy or her own desire for vicarious revenge, mentioned your circumstances to Dr. Bellamy during a social gathering. The doctor had treated her husband during his final illness, you comprehend. They had remained in contact. Mrs. Pemberton's face had gone pale, but she nodded slowly. I thought only that they might comfort each other, having both suffered at Sir Reginald's hands. I never imagined— Perhaps not, Poirot said gently. But you provided the connection, and that connection became a conspiracy. Dr. Bellamy and Miss Hartwell met, shared their grief and anger, and gradually the idea of murder took root. But how to accomplish it? Sir Reginald was a cautious man, difficult to approach, surrounded by servants and associates. Then came the opportunity, the midnight express to Dover. Sir Reginald travelled this route regularly, always in a first-class compartment, always alone, always with his brandy flask. He paused, his green eyes fixed on Dr. Bellamy. You purchased tickets for the same train, making certain you occupied the compartment adjacent to where Sir Reginald usually sat. Compartment 3B, next to 3A. But there was a problem. You could not be certain which compartment Sir Reginald would actually occupy until the night of travel. So you prepared to be flexible, to adapt your plan as circumstances required. Dr. Bellamy's voice emerged rough, strained. You seem to know everything, Monsieur Poirot. Why ask me to confirm it? Because I wish to understand not merely what happened, but why. The human heart, it is complex, no? Even in murder, there are gradations of guilt, degrees of culpability that matter to those of us who seek justice rather than merely vengeance. Miss Hartwell raised her tear-stained face. I arranged for Mrs. Pemberton's tickets. I knew Sir Reginald's travel schedule from correspondence I had seen in his solicitor's office. I visited there seeking information about my brother's case. I knew he would be on this train. Dr. Bellamy and I planned every detail. We even rehearsed it, timing how long the gas would take to act, how much we would need. And last night, Poirot prompted. Last night, everything went as planned, Dr. Bellamy said, his voice devoid of emotion now, as though he were reciting a medical case history. Sir Reginald boarded and took compartment 3A as expected. I was in 3B. Once the train departed and he locked his door, I waited 30 minutes to ensure he had settled. Then I prepared the apparatus. A small glass vessel with the cyanide salts, a rubber tube leading to the ventilation grill. I added the acid, sealed the vessel, and let the gas flow through the tube into Sir Reginald's compartment. "How long did it take?" Inspector Hardcastle asked, his voice hoarse. "Perhaps 5 minutes for the gas to have effect. I heard nothing. The walls are thick, and Sir Reginald would have lost consciousness quickly. Hydrogen cyanide interferes with cellular respiration. His death follows within minutes." The clinical precision of his description was somehow more chilling than emotion would have been. "And then you waited," Poirot continued, "waited until the early hours of the morning. At some point you used your master medical knowledge to pick the lock on Sir Reginald's compartment door. A simple lock, easily managed by a man with your dexterity and anatomical understanding. You entered, added liquid cyanide to the brandy flask to create the false trail, arranged the body slightly to suggest he had clutched at his throat, then locked the door again from the outside using a thin implement passed through the gap. A trick known to many, but requiring steady hands. A surgeon's hands. "I am not a surgeon," Dr. Bellamy said quietly. "But yes, I have steady hands. I have held instruments, delivered children, unclosed the eyes of the dying, and last night I used those hands to kill a man who deserved to die." "Did he?" Poirot's question hung in the air. Did Sir Reginald Ashcroft deserve death without trial, without the opportunity to defend himself, without mercy or forgiveness? You appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner, Doctor. You who swore an oath to preserve life. Dr. Bellamy's face contorted with sudden, passionate intensity. "You speak of oaths, Monsieur Poirot? What of Sir Reginald's obligations? What of the duty a man of wealth and position owes to his own family, to those who depend upon his mercy?" Young Thomas Hartwell lay dying, gasping for breath, begging for help that could have saved him. I pleaded with Sir Reginald to pay for sanatorium treatment, for the new medications available in Switzerland. Now, do you know what he said to me? He said, "Why should I waste good money on bad blood?" Those were his exact words. Bad blood. As though Thomas was somehow tainted, unworthy of life because his parents had not troubled to marry. Miss Hartwell's voice joined his, trembling but determined. Thomas was gentle and kind. He wanted to be a teacher, to help children learn. He had committed no sin except being born, and Sir Reginald condemned him to death as surely as if he had put a pillow over his face. When Thomas died, when I held his hand and felt his pulse fade, I swore I would make Sir Reginald pay. I swore it on my brother's grave. "And so you did," Poirot said quietly. "But at what cost? You have taken a life, violated every principle of law and civilization, and now you will face the consequences. Justice, when achieved through murder, ceases to be justice. It becomes merely revenge." Lady Constance spoke suddenly, her voice cutting through the emotion like a blade through silk. "And what of Sir Reginald's victims, Monsieur Poirot? Are we to weep for him? He destroyed lives with casual cruelty. He ruined Dr. Bellamy's reputation out of spite, drove his own daughter to suicide through his tyranny, bankrupted Mr. Merrick through deliberate deception, sent his son to die in a war he need not have fought. How many lives must one man destroy before someone stops him? That is for the law to decide, madame, not for individuals acting in darkness," Poirot replied. "But you raise a question that troubles me deeply. The law, it moves slowly. It requires evidence, proof, procedures that can take years. Meanwhile, do men like Sir Reginald continue their cruelties, protected by wealth and position. What is one to do when the law fails? It is a question I cannot answer to my own satisfaction." Inspector Hardcastle had regained his composure and his sense of duty. "Philosophy aside, Monsieur Poirot, we have confessions from both Dr. Bellamy and Miss Hartwell. I must place them under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Ashcroft." "One moment, Inspector." Poirot held up his hand. "There remains the matter of the package Sir Reginald left with his solicitor. I believe it may be relevant to our understanding of this case." As if summoned by Poirot's words, there came a knock at the door. A railway official entered, carrying a brown paper parcel and accompanied by a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, wearing the formal attire of a solicitor. "Mr. Pemberton Cross?" The solicitor introduced himself. "I received Inspector Hardcastle's urgent summons and came as quickly as possible. This is the package Sir Reginald left in my safe yesterday evening." He placed it on the table with evident relief at being rid of it. Poirot examined the package carefully before opening it. Inside were several documents and a leather-bound journal. He read silently for several minutes while the assembled group watched with mounting tension. His expression, usually so controlled, registered surprise, then something close to dismay. Finally, he looked up. "Inspector, I must share with you the contents of these documents. They are most illuminating, though not in the way I anticipated." He held up the journal. "This is Sir Reginald's private diary, detailing his activities over the past 6 months. Auntie, and these documents are drafts of a new will. Not the will he discussed with Mr. Pemberton Cross, but a different one entirely." "What do they say?" Lady Constance demanded. Poirot's voice was heavy with an emotion difficult to identify. "They say that Sir Reginald Ashcroft had been diagnosed with an aggressive cancer 6 months ago. He had perhaps 3 months to live, possibly less. The pain was becoming unbearable. And he had decided—" Poirot paused, choosing his words carefully. "He had decided to make amends. This new will leaves substantial sums to everyone he believed he had wronged. £50,000 to Dr. Bellamy with a formal apology for the false complaint. 20,000 to Mr. Merrick to compensate for the failed gallery. Provisions for Miss Hartwell acknowledging her as family. And even a bequest to a memorial fund in Caroline Ashcroft's name." The silence that followed was absolute. Miss Hartwell's face had gone white as chalk. Dr. Bellamy sat frozen, comprehension and horror warring in his expression. "But that's impossible," Miss Hartwell whispered. "He refused to help Thomas. He let my brother die." "Perhaps," Poirot said gently. Facing his own death changed him. Perhaps guilt, that most human of emotions, finally penetrated his armored heart. "We cannot know. But the diary makes clear that Sir Reginald knew he was dying and wished to seek redemption before the end." Dr. Bellamy's hands began to tremble. The steady surgeon's hands that had administered death now shaking with the weight of irrevocable error. He stared at the documents spread before Poirot as though they were instruments of torture. "We didn't know," he whispered. "How could we have known?" "You could not," Poirot said simply. "And therein lies the terrible tragedy of this affair. You appointed yourselves executioners of a man who had already been condemned by a higher power, a man who sought in his final weeks to make restitution for a lifetime of cruelty. Your justice, rendered in haste and secrecy, prevented his redemption and denied his victims the compensation he wished to provide." Miss Hartwell had collapsed completely, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed torn from her very soul. Mrs. Pemberton placed an arm around her, but the gesture seemed futile, inadequate to the magnitude of the girl's anguish. Inspector Hardcastle cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Be that as it may, Monsieur Poirot, the law is clear. A murder has been committed, confessed to, and must be answered for. Dr. Marcus Bellamy and Miss Lily Hartwell, I am arresting you for the willful murder of Sir Reginald Ashcroft. You will be transported to London and held pending trial." The doctor rose with dignity, extending his wrists for the handcuffs. I accept the consequences of my actions, Inspector. I killed a man I believed to be a monster. That he may have been transforming into something better does not absolve me. I'm a physician who violated his oath. I deserve whatever punishment the law prescribes." Miss Hartwell, however, seemed incapable of movement. She remained hunched on the settee, weeping inconsolably. It was Lady Constance who moved to help her stand, supporting the girl with surprising gentleness. "Come, child," Lady Constance said quietly. "Face what must be faced with what dignity you can muster. It is all any of us can do in the end." As Constable Briggs led the two prisoners from the sitting room, the remaining passengers sat in stunned silence. The revelation of Sir Reginald's intended restitution had transformed their understanding of the case entirely. What had seemed a justified, even noble act of vengeance now appeared as something far more ambiguous and tragic. Mr. Merrick spoke first, his voice subdued. £20,000. It would have restored everything I lost, allowed me to rebuild my life, and now it's gone, rendered void by his death before the will could be executed. We are all diminished by this, Lady Constance said. Sir Reginald was preparing to acknowledge his failures, to make amends. Perhaps in dying he might have redeemed himself. Instead, he died believing himself hated and alone, denied even the satisfaction of his final generous act. Poirot had been gathering his gloves and walking stick, preparing to depart. Now he paused, his green eyes thoughtful. "You speak truly, madame. This case, it has disturbed me more than most. Usually when Hercule Poirot solves a murder, there is satisfaction in seeing justice done, in exposing the guilty and protecting the innocent. But here there are no innocents, only victims. Sir Reginald was a cruel man who caused immeasurable suffering. Dr. Bellamy and Miss Hartwell were wounded souls seeking revenge for genuine wrongs. And all of you," his gaze swept the remaining passengers, "you carry scars inflicted by a man who wielded wealth as a weapon." "And what is the lesson, Monsieur Poirot?" Miss Carruthers asked, and her voice small and uncertain. "What are we to learn from this terrible affair?" Poirot considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think, mademoiselle, that we learn the danger of certainty. Dr. Bellamy and Miss Hartwell were certain of Sir Reginald's irredeemable evil. They were certain their cause was just, their action necessary. But certainty, it blinds us to possibility, to the chance that people may change, that redemption may come even to those who seem beyond its reach. They did not wait, did not investigate, did not allow for the complexity of human nature. And now they will pay with their freedom, possibly their lives, for that fatal certainty." He moved toward the door, then turned back one final time. "We live in an imperfect world, where justice is slow and often incomplete, and where the wicked prosper and the innocent suffer. It is tempting to take matters into one's own hands, to become the instrument of vengeance when the law seems inadequate. But murder, even of the guilty, diminishes us all. It reduces us to the level of those we despise. Better to trust in time, in the possibility of change, in the slow but steady progress of conscience and consequence." Inspector Hardcastle had been waiting impatiently. "Fine words, Monsieur Poirot, but the train must depart. Your work here is finished." "Yes," Poirot agreed, stepping into the corridor. "My work is finished, though I take no pleasure in it. This was not a case of good triumphing over evil, but of evil multiplying itself, of pain breeding pain, and of wounds that fester rather than heal." He descended from the train onto the platform where the morning sun had finally burned away the last traces of fog. The air was crisp and clear, carrying the promise of better weather ahead. Behind him, the midnight express to Dover stood silent, its elegant carriages now forever associated with tragedy and irony. As Poirot walked toward the station exit, his walking stick tapping a precise rhythm on the platform stones, he reflected on the essential sadness of the human condition. We are all, he thought, capable of both great cruelty and unexpected grace. We wound and are wounded, judge and are judged, seek revenge and redemption in equal measure. At the station entrance, he paused to adjust his hat to its proper angle, to ensure his bow tie sat precisely centered, and to restore the external order that reflected his inner discipline. These small rituals comforted him, reminded him that in a world of moral ambiguity and tragic ironies, there remained the possibility of precision, of method, of the logical mind imposing sense upon chaos. A taxi waited at the curb. As Poirot settled into its worn leather seat and gave the driver his London address, he permitted himself one final thought about the affair at the Midnight Express. Justice had been served, after a fashion. The guilty would be punished, but no one would be restored, no wrong would be undone, and somewhere in the cosmic ledger of human suffering, a small additional entry had been made. Another tragedy, another waste, another demonstration that revenge, however justified it may seem, ultimately satisfies no one and redeems nothing. And that, Hercule Poirot murmured to himself as the taxi pulled away from Bromley South Station, is perhaps the saddest truth that the little grey cells have ever been required to comprehend. The end.